She grabbed the remote right out of my hand, looked straight at the television, and said 5 words that changed everything between us forever. "This is our house now." I sat there in my recliner. The same recliner I'd owned for 11 years, in the same living room I'd paid for across 3 decades, and I felt something shift inside me that I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not sadness. Not embarrassment. Something quieter and far more dangerous than either of those things. Clarity. Before I tell you what I did next, hit subscribe, because what I'm about to share with you is something every parent with a married child needs to hear before it's too late. My name is Patricia Callahan. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 35 years building a home from nothing in Dayton, Ohio. And the moment my daughter-in-law decided it belonged to her, I made a decision that nobody in my family saw coming. Stay until the end, because the last part of this story will leave your jaw on the floor. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand exactly what this house meant before you can understand what I did to protect it. My husband Gerald and I bought this house in 1988, the year our son Brian turned 3 years old. It was a modest colonial on a quiet street in Dayton. Nothing fancy, nothing extravagant, but it was ours. We painted every room ourselves. We installed the back porch ourselves. I planted every flower in that front yard with my own 2 hands across 30 years of springs. Gerald passed away in 2019, and suddenly this house stopped being just a home and became the last place on earth where I still felt his presence everywhere I looked. Comment below if you've ever held onto a place because letting go of it meant letting go of someone. Because that's exactly what this house was for me when Kelsey walked into it and decided it was hers. Brian met Kelsey at work about 4 years ago. She seemed pleasant enough at first, polite at family dinners, friendly at holidays, the kind of person who says all the right things in front of the right people. I noticed small things early on. The way she sometimes spoke over me in conversations, the way she rearranged things in my kitchen when she visited without asking, the way she'd suggest changes to my home, as if she were already the one living there. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I told myself this was just a new generation doing things differently. I told myself a lot of things I now wish I hadn't, because every small thing I dismissed as nothing was actually a preview of exactly what was coming. If you've ever ignored red flags because you loved someone connected to the person showing them, you already know precisely how this part of the story ends. But nothing prepared me for how quickly everything escalated once they moved in. When Brian lost his job during the pandemic, I did what any mother would do without a second thought. I told them both they could move in with me temporarily while they got back on their feet. My house had 3 bedrooms, and it was just me rattling around inside it alone since Gerald passed. It made complete sense at the time. Brian was grateful, genuinely, in the way he'd always been grateful when life got hard and he needed his mother. Kelsey smiled and said all the right things about how much it meant to her and how they'd be out of my hair before I even noticed them there. That was 14 months ago. They're still here. And somewhere between month 2 and month 14, Kelsey stopped being a grateful guest and started behaving like a woman who decided my house was simply hers to manage as she saw fit. What happened next happened so gradually, I almost didn't notice it until the night she grabbed that remote. It started with small things, the way these situations always do. She moved my good dishes to a different cabinet without mentioning it. She replaced my kitchen towels with ones she preferred and threw mine away without asking. She rearranged the living room furniture one afternoon while I was at my doctor's appointment and acted surprised when I noticed, like the change was obvious and necessary, and I was being difficult for mentioning it. Brian never said a word about any of it. Every time I brought something up gently, he'd find somewhere else to be, something else to need his attention. If you have a partner or a spouse who goes quiet the moment someone needs to stand up for you, you know exactly how that silence feels landing in the room where you expected support to be. Each small thing Kelsey changed felt like a tiny piece of my home being quietly transferred to her name, without my permission or even my awareness. By month 6, she had repainted the hallway, without asking me. The color Gerald and I had chosen together 30 years ago, a warm cream that I'd repainted faithfully every few years because I loved it, was gone overnight, replaced by a stark gray that she said felt more modern. I stood in that hallway the morning after and genuinely felt like a stranger in my own home. I said nothing. I kept the peace the way mothers do when they're terrified of fracturing the relationship with their child over something they tell themselves is just paint. I want you to remember that hallway, because I'm going to come back to it later in the story, and what I did about it in the end is something Kelsey absolutely did not see coming from the quiet woman she'd been walking all over for months. Keep watching, because the moment that remote left my hand is where everything finally changed. The night it all broke open started like any ordinary evening. The Browns were down by 3 with less than 5 minutes left in the fourth quarter, and I was sitting in my recliner. My recliner, the one I'd owned for 11 years, the one Gerald had helped me pick out from the furniture store on Salem Avenue, watching the game with a cup of decaf in my hand. Kelsey walked in from the kitchen, didn't slow down, didn't glance at me, didn't ask a single question. She simply reached over, pulled the remote directly from my hand, and changed the channel to a home renovation show without saying a single word. Then she dropped onto the couch, pulled a blanket over her legs, and settled in like the decision required no discussion because as far as she was concerned it didn't. For 3 full seconds, I sat there wondering if what just happened had actually happened. It had. And that's when she said it. "Go back to your room, old man," she said, still without looking at me, eyes fixed on the television, voice completely casual, like she was asking someone to pass the salt. "This is our living room now." The room felt like it shrank in that moment. On the screen, a smiling couple was arguing about kitchen cabinets. The remote was still warm from my hand. I looked over at Brian. He was standing maybe 15 feet away in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of iced tea. He looked up, looked directly at me, then looked back down at his glass. Not one single word. Not a glance toward Kelsey. Not even a shift in his posture. Just silence. The specific, deliberate kind of silence that tells you everything you need to know about where a person actually stands when it matters most. If you're a parent watching this right now, I need you to pay close attention to what I decided in the next 30 seconds. I pushed myself slowly up from my recliner. My knees complained immediately the way they always do. Arthritis had been winning that particular battle for years. I straightened up, looked at Kelsey one long moment while she stared at her renovation show completely unbothered, then looked at Brian one final time. He was still looking at his glass. I walked quietly to my bedroom, closed the door behind me, and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time. But here's what I need you to understand. I wasn't crying. I wasn't feeling sorry for myself. I wasn't planning to bring it up at breakfast the next morning and hope things improved on their own. I was thinking clearly, maybe more clearly than I had in months, because something had finally snapped into place for me that night, and what it told me was something I should have acted on long before Kelsey ever touched that remote. I thought about Gerald. I thought about what he would have said if he'd been sitting in that recliner beside me and watched someone tell his wife to go back to her room in her own house. I already knew the answer. Gerald was a quiet man in most things, but there were lines he never allowed anyone to cross, and the line around his family's dignity was one of them. Sitting on that bed, I made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not a vengeful one. A practical, clear-headed, completely legal decision that I should have made the moment I first noticed Kelsey treating my home like a hotel she'd been handed the management of. I picked up my phone and I called my sister Carol, who lives 40 minutes away. "I need you to come over tomorrow," I told her. "Bring the truck." Carol didn't ask many questions. She just said, "What time do you need me there?" That's the kind of sister she is. And what we did the next morning is where this story really begins. The next morning I was up before anyone else in the house. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat at my kitchen table. My kitchen table, the one Gerald and I bought at an estate sale in 1994 and refinished together in the garage over one long weekend. And I wrote a list. Not a list of grievances. Not a list of things Kelsey had done wrong over 14 months. A simple, practical inventory of every single item in this house that belonged to me before Brian ever met Kelsey, before either of them ever moved through my front door. The list was longer than I expected. 4 full pages, front and back, by the time I finished my second cup of coffee. If you've ever sat down and actually counted the things that belong to you, you know that the total is always larger than you think, because we spend so much time just living around our belongings that we stop actually seeing them. I saw every single one of them that morning. Carol arrived at 8:30 with her husband Ray and his pickup truck, the large one with the extended bed. I met them at the door before they could ring the bell. Brian and Kelsey were still asleep. They rarely got up before 10 on weekends. Another small thing I'd quietly adjusted my entire morning routine around for 14 months without once being asked to. We started in the living room. My recliner went first, loaded carefully into the bed of Ray's truck with moving blankets around it. Then my bookshelf, the solid oak one Gerald built himself in the garage the year Brian started high school. Then the side table with the lamp that had been my mother's. Then the framed photographs Kelsey had quietly moved from the main wall to a narrow hallway corner because, as she'd once told Brian within my earshot, they made the living room feel cluttered. If you want to know what taking back your dignity looks like in practice, it looks exactly like this. We worked quietly, efficiently, Carol and Ray and I, moving room by room through the house with my 4-page list as our guide. The dining room table and chairs, mine, bought before Brian's first birthday. The chest freezer in the garage, mine, purchased in 2003. The garden tools in the shed that I'd accumulated over 30 years of maintaining that yard. The decorative items Kelsey had moved to less prominent spots because they didn't match her preferred aesthetic. I took every single one of them back. I wasn't being vindictive. I want to make that absolutely clear. Everything I loaded into Ray's truck was mine before Kelsey existed in any of our lives. I wasn't taking a single thing that belonged to them. I was simply collecting what was already mine and removing it from a space where it had apparently become invisible to the people who'd decided they owned that space. Keep watching, because this is where it gets really interesting. We were on the third room when I heard footsteps on the stairs. I kept moving, unhooking my framed cross-stitch from the hallway wall, the one I'd made myself the winter after Brian was born, 40 years ago, hanging in this house his entire life. Brian appeared at the bottom of the stairs in a t-shirt and sweatpants, still half asleep, squinting at the activity in the hallway. He looked at me. He looked at Carol. He looked at Ray carrying a box toward the front door. "Mom," he said slowly, the way people say a word when they're not entirely sure yet what question to attach to it. "Morning," I said pleasantly, without stopping what I was doing. "What's happening?" he asked, more awake now, looking around at the walls where familiar things were noticeably absent. I turned around, looked my son directly in the eyes, and said the 5 words I'd been waiting 14 months to say clearly and without apology. "I'm taking what is mine." Brian stared at me for a long moment. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means exactly what I said," I told him calmly. "Everything in this house that was mine before you two moved in is coming with me. The things that belong to you and Kelsey are staying." He looked around again at the visible gaps on walls, the missing furniture, the boxes stacked near the front door. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Carol's," I said simply. "Until I figure out the next step." He was quiet for a moment, processing everything faster now that sleep was wearing off. Then he said something that told me he still hadn't quite understood the significance of what had happened the night before. "Mom, last night was just Kelsey being tired. She didn't mean anything by it." If you have ever heard someone dismiss a moment that changed everything for you as simply someone having a bad day, you know exactly how that sentence landed. "She told me to go back to my room, Brian," I said, still pleasant, still calm. "In my house. That I've owned for 35 years. That I invited you both into. And you were standing 15 feet away and said nothing." He opened his mouth, closed it again. "So, I'm not angry," I continued, folding a quilt that had been my grandmother's carefully into a box. "I'm not here to have an argument or make a scene. I'm simply collecting my belongings, the way any person is entitled to do with things that belong to them." He stood there watching us work for another few minutes, running his hands through his hair, doing that thing he's done since he was a teenager when he's trying to figure out which way a conversation is going to land. Then he went back upstairs. What happened 10 minutes later, when Kelsey finally came downstairs, is the part of this story I genuinely wish I had on video. I heard her before I saw her, the sharp intake of breath from the living room doorway, followed by a silence that was different from Brian's. His silence had been confusion. Hers was something else entirely. I was in the kitchen when she came in, carefully wrapping my good dishes, my mother's china, 32 pieces, not a single one of which Kelsey had ever been asked to use, but all of which she'd moved to a less accessible cabinet to make room for her own preferences. Kelsey stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the half-empty cabinets with an expression I recognized immediately. Not hurt, not remorse. Indignation. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular edge I'd become very familiar with over 14 months. "Good morning," I said warmly, wrapping another plate. "I'm packing my things." She looked at Carol, then at Ray passing through with another box. "Brian," she called upstairs sharply. Brian came back downstairs and the three of us stood in the kitchen that had been mine for 35 years, that I had cooked 10,000 meals in, that Gerald had retiled himself one summer in the late 90s. Kelsey looked at Brian with an expression that clearly expected him to fix whatever she decided I was doing wrong. "Tell her she can't just take everything," she said to him, gesturing around at the kitchen. Brian looked at me uncertainly. "Mom, maybe we should talk about this first before—" "Brian," I said gently, "can you tell me one item in this house that you bought, or that Kelsey bought, that I am currently packing?" He looked around. He couldn't, because there wasn't one. Everything in those boxes was mine, documented on 4 pages in my handwriting sitting on the counter beside me. If you've ever watched someone realize mid-argument that they have no ground to stand on, you know exactly what Brian's face looked like. Kelsey didn't give up that easily. "You can't strip the house like this," she said, her voice rising now. "We live here. We need these things. You're welcome to go purchase whatever you need," I told her simply. "I'm only taking what was already mine." "This is our home," she said, and I want you to pay close attention to that word, because in that sentence, she revealed exactly the mindset that had been growing inside her for 14 months. Our home. Not my home that she was living in temporarily. Not my home that I'd graciously opened to them during a difficult time. Our home. Like possession had transferred somewhere between the day they moved in their suitcases and the night she grabbed my remote. I looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "No," I said clearly, for what was the very first time in 14 months. "It isn't." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd heard in that house since Gerald passed. Kelsey stared at me. Brian stared at the floor. Carol pretended to be very busy examining the contents of a cabinet. Ray was wisely somewhere near the truck. "I have owned this house since 1988, I continued, still calmly, still without raising my voice. "My name is on the deed. My husband built that porch with his own hands. I planted every flower in that front yard. I have been patient with changes I never asked for, silent about disrespect I should have addressed months ago, and grateful for the company even when that company stopped treating me like the owner of the home they were living in for free. That changes today." Brian finally looked up. Something shifted in his face, something I recognized from when he was a boy who'd done something wrong and finally understood why. Keep watching, because what happened after that conversation changed the living arrangements entirely. By noon, Ray's truck was fully loaded. Everything on my 4-page list was either already at Carol's or sitting neatly in boxes in her garage waiting for me to figure out my next step. I'd left everything that genuinely belonged to Brian and Kelsey completely untouched. Their bedroom furniture, their electronics, Kelsey's kitchen items she'd gradually introduced alongside mine over 14 months. I'd taken nothing that wasn't mine. But standing in that living room looking at what remained, the house felt different to me than it had even that same morning. It felt, for the first time in 14 months, honest. Brian found me near the front door as I was putting on my coat. He looked like a man who'd aged 10 years since breakfast. "Mom," he said quietly, making sure Kelsey wasn't nearby. "I should have said something last night. I should have said something." It was the closest he'd come to an apology, and I won't tell you exactly what I said back to him. "Yes," I said simply. "You should have." Then I hugged him because he is still my son regardless of every other complicated thing attached to that fact, and I walked out to Carol's car. I want you to understand something important about that moment before we go further in the story. Leaving wasn't defeat. Leaving wasn't weakness. Leaving wasn't me running away from a conflict I should have stayed to fight. Leaving was the most powerful thing I had done in that house in 14 months, because it was the first time I had done something for myself instead of absorbing whatever was handed to me in the name of keeping the peace. If you've ever stayed somewhere or in something longer than you should have because you were afraid of what standing up for yourself would cost you, this part of the story is specifically for you. Because what standing up for myself actually cost me was far less than what staying silent had already taken. Carol's house was small but warm, and she'd already set up the guest room before I arrived. That first night, I sat on the edge of the guest bed and realized something unexpected. I felt lighter than I had in over a year. Not happy exactly, not yet. But lighter, in the specific way you feel when you've set down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you stopped noticing the weight of it. I thought about the 14 months of small surrenders, each one reasonable on its own, each one easily explained away, that had collectively added up to the moment Kelsey grabbed a remote from my hand and told me to go back to my room in my own house. I thought about every dish she'd moved, every wall she'd repainted, every morning I'd quietly reorganized my schedule around 2 people who weren't paying rent. And I thought about my 4-page list and how good it had felt to simply take back what was already mine. Brian called that evening. I let it ring twice before answering, not to be dramatic, but because I wanted to be sure I was actually ready to have the conversation calmly instead of emotionally. "Are you okay?" he asked. The question struck me as interesting. He wasn't asking about the house, about the furniture, about Kelsey's feelings. He was asking about me, which told me that somewhere during the day he'd done some thinking of his own. "I'm fine," I told him honestly. "Better than I've been in a while." He was quiet for a moment. "Kelsey is upset," he said finally. "I imagine she is," I agreed. Another pause. "She said you overreacted." I took a slow breath. If you've ever been told you overreacted to something that had been building for over a year, you know exactly the kind of patience that simple accusation requires to meet calmly. What I said next is something I'd been quietly rehearsing my whole drive to Carol's. "Brian," I said, "your wife told me to go back to my room in the house I've owned for 35 years. That's not something a person overreacts to. That's something a person finally reacts to after staying quiet far too long." He didn't respond immediately. "I didn't take anything that wasn't mine," I continued. "I left everything of yours and Kelsey's exactly where it was. I simply removed my belongings from a space where they and I apparently were no longer being treated with any particular respect." Silence on his end. "What do you want to happen now?" he asked quietly. It was the right question, the first genuinely right thing he'd asked all day, and it told me he was finally thinking about this situation from my perspective instead of trying to manage it from Kelsey's. I had a clear, specific answer ready, and what I told him next set the terms for everything that followed over the next 3 months. "I want 3 things," I told him. "First, I want an actual apology from Kelsey. Not the kind that explains why she said what she said, just a real acknowledgement that it was wrong. Second, I want a clear conversation about what living arrangements actually look like going forward, with actual boundaries that get respected this time. And third, I want my house treated like what it is, my house, for as long as I'm choosing to allow anyone else to live in it." Brian listened to all 3 without interrupting, which was itself progress compared to the silence he'd offered me the night before. "I'll talk to her," he said. "Okay," I replied. "Let me know what she says." I hung up, made myself a cup of tea, and sat with Carol in her kitchen until almost midnight talking about everything I probably should have talked about 14 months earlier. What happened over the following week, though, tested every bit of patience I had left. Kelsey did not apologize that week. Brian called twice with explanations. She needed more time. She was still upset. She felt ambushed by what I'd done, and each time I listened politely and said the same thing. "I'm here when she's ready." I stayed at Carol's and focused on something I hadn't had space to focus on in over a year. My own comfort, my own routine, my own mornings without reorganizing my schedule around 2 other people who'd stopped saying thank you for the accommodation. I started sleeping better almost immediately, which told me something important about the toll the previous 14 months had actually taken on my body without me fully registering it. On day 9, my phone rang, not Brian's number this time, Kelsey's. I stared at it for a moment, then answered. What she said when I picked up was not what I expected, and it shifted something between us in a way I wasn't entirely prepared for. "I want to come talk to you," Kelsey said. Her voice was different, quieter, the sharpness I'd become accustomed to noticeably absent. In person. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop on the west side of Dayton, neutral ground, public enough that neither of us would be tempted toward drama. She arrived looking like someone who hadn't been sleeping well, which I noticed without saying anything because I'm not a person who leads with the wound even when I'd be entitled to. We sat across from each other with coffee cups between us, and a silence that lasted just long enough to feel honest rather than awkward. Then Kelsey looked at me and said something that I genuinely did not expect from her, based on everything I'd observed across 14 months of living with her under my own roof. If you've ever completely misjudged someone's capacity for self-awareness and had that misjudgment corrected in a single conversation, you know exactly what that coffee felt like. "I've been turning into my mother," Kelsey said quietly, staring at her cup. "And I hate that." I waited, letting the space around her words do their work without filling it. "My mother takes over every space she walks into," she continued. "I grew up watching her do it. I swore I'd never be that way." She looked up at me. "I became her anyway, and I didn't even notice it happening until you left, and Brian showed me what I'd actually been doing." He listed it out, month by month. If you're watching this and thinking that nobody who behaves badly is ever truly self-aware about it, I want you to hold that assumption lightly, because sitting across from Kelsey in that coffee shop was the most surprised I'd been by another person in years. What she said next is the part that actually made me understand how this had gone so far before either of us addressed it. "I think I was scared," Kelsey admitted, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. "When we moved in, I felt like a guest in your home, and I didn't know how to stop feeling that way. So I started doing things to make it feel less like visiting and more like living. And I never stopped. I never asked. I just kept going." She paused. "That comment the other night was the worst thing I've ever said to another person. I want you to know that I know that." I sat with her words for a long moment before responding. I'm not a person who accepts apologies immediately just to make the discomfort in the room go away. But I also know the difference between a performance and something real, and what Kelsey was offering across that coffee table felt real in a way that surprised me. "I appreciate you saying that," I told her honestly. "But an apology is only the beginning of what needs to change between us." We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, the longest real conversation Kelsey and I had ever had despite 14 months of living under the same roof. She told me about her mother, about growing up in a household where dominance and control were dressed up as helpfulness and care until they were indistinguishable from each other. I told her about Gerald, about what building this house into a home had meant to us, about how every item she'd moved or replaced or repainted without asking had chipped away at something I hadn't known how to name until I was already loading it into Ray's truck. We weren't friends by the end of that conversation, but we were something we hadn't been before, honest with each other. And sometimes honesty between two people who've been quietly circling each other is the most significant thing that can happen between them. What came next took all three of us to build together. Brian asked if he could come to Carol's the following Saturday for what he called a real conversation, not a phone call. I said yes. He arrived with coffee, which told me he'd been thinking about how to approach things rather than just showing up and hoping for the best. The three of us sat around Carol's kitchen table, Brian, me, and eventually Kelsey, who arrived 20 minutes later, slightly nervous, which was so different from the composed certainty I was accustomed to seeing from her that it actually put me more at ease than I expected. We talked for 3 hours. About the house, about boundaries, about what living together could actually look like if all three of us were honest about what we each needed instead of silently building resentment around assumptions that were never questioned out loud. It was the conversation we should have had before they ever moved a single box through my front door 14 months earlier. By the end of that Saturday, we'd agreed on something that felt surprisingly simple once we actually said it out loud. The house was mine. My name was on the deed. My history was in every wall and floorboard, and my right to make decisions about it was non-negotiable regardless of how long they stayed or how comfortable they became within it. In exchange for that clarity, I would commit to giving them real space within the home rather than hovering over every room, trusting them to make reasonable day-to-day decisions and actually communicating directly instead of absorbing things silently until they became unbearable. It sounds obvious, I know.
Most things do once they've been said.
The hard part was that none of those obvious things had been said in 14 months, and the cost of that silence had nearly broken 3 relationships at once. I moved back home 2 weeks later. But things were noticeably different from the moment I walked back through that door. The first thing I noticed when I walked back in was my recliner, sitting back in its spot in the living room where it had always been. Brian and Ray had gone to Carol's and brought it back while I was packing my things. On the side table beside it, also back in place, was the lamp that had been my mother's, the one Kelsey had moved to the hallway corner because it didn't match her preferred color scheme. Kelsey was standing near the kitchen doorway watching me take all of this in. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I thought it should go back where it belonged." 4 months earlier, that sentence would have required a small miracle. Standing in my own living room hearing it, I felt something release in my chest that had been held tight for a very long time. "Thank you," I told her simply. Sometimes the right thing said at the right time is worth more than 100 grand gestures. The weeks that followed were not perfect. I want to be completely honest with you about that because this isn't that kind of story. Old habits don't disappear because 3 people sit around a table and decide they should. There were moments when I noticed Kelsey starting to slip back into old patterns, reaching for control in small ways when stress was high, and I had to make the choice each time to address it directly rather than absorb it quietly the way I'd done before. And I did address it every time, calmly, and without making it larger than it needed to be. That direct communication turned out to be the single most important change between us, more than any conversation or agreement. The moment I stopped managing my own discomfort silently and started simply saying what I needed out loud, Kelsey had something to respond to rather than a void to fill with her own assumptions. Brian changed too, in ways I hadn't anticipated. Once Kelsey and I began actually communicating with each other directly, he stopped being the person caught in the middle, and that freed him up to be something he's much better at: a son. He started having dinner with me alone once a week, just the 2 of us, the way we used to before Kelsey, and the general busyness of adult life had quietly crowded those moments out. He talked about his father more during those dinners than he had in the 4 years since Gerald passed, stories I'd heard before, and ones I hadn't. Details about their relationship that I hadn't known were still alive in Brian's memory. If you've ever rediscovered a relationship that had quietly faded beneath the weight of routine, you know how unexpectedly moving it is to find it still there, intact, waiting to be picked back up. About 2 months after I moved back home, Kelsey did something that I didn't see coming and haven't fully known how to talk about until right now. She asked me if I'd be willing to show her how to do something. Not in the house. Not furniture arrangement or kitchen organization. She asked me to teach her how to make Gerald's chili. She'd apparently heard Brian talk about it for years, how his father had made it every first Sunday of October without fail, how the smell of it meant fall was officially starting in our house. She asked quietly, a little uncertain, like she wasn't sure if the request would be welcome or intrusive. If you've ever been asked by someone you've had difficulty with to share something that belongs to the best part of your history, you know that it's a surprisingly vulnerable thing to be asked. I said yes. We spent a Sunday afternoon in that kitchen together, Kelsey and I, making Gerald's chili from the recipe card in his handwriting that I've kept in the same kitchen drawer for 26 years. She asked questions about him, real ones, not polite ones, and I answered them honestly, including the parts that were complicated and the parts that still made me laugh. By the time Brian came home and walked into the smell of that chili filling the house, he stood in the kitchen doorway and got quiet in the way people do when something reaches the part of them that's still a child in the best sense of the word. "That smells like Dad," he said. It was the best thing that had happened in that kitchen in a very long time. And it happened because 2 women who'd spent 14 months misunderstanding each other finally sat down together long enough to understand something instead. I want to stop here and say something directly to anyone watching this who recognizes themselves in this story, whether you're the parent, the child, or the person who walked into someone's home and slowly, without meaning to, started treating it like your own. None of what happened in my house happened because anyone involved was a bad person. Kelsey wasn't a villain. Brian wasn't a coward, not really. I wasn't a perfect mother or a perfect homeowner. We were three people who never clearly said what we needed, assumed the others understood things they couldn't have known, and let 14 months of unspoken resentment build a wall between us that eventually had to come down the hard way. The remote was never really about the remote. The chili was never really about the chili. Both of them were about something far simpler, being seen and respected in the spaces we call home. That's all any of us actually wanted. A few weeks ago, Brian and Kelsey told me something over dinner that I genuinely wasn't expecting yet. They're expecting their first child, due in the spring. I sat across the table absorbing it. The news, the timing, the particular weight of becoming a grandmother in the house where I raised the man who is now going to be a father. Kelsey watched my face carefully while Brian talked, the way she does now when she's gauging a reaction she's not entirely sure of. Then she said, quietly, "We're hoping you'll want to be here for all of it. The whole thing. Not as hired help. Not as a convenient presence in an otherwise full house. As a grandmother, specifically and genuinely wanted." I looked at her for a moment and thought about that Sunday in the kitchen with Gerald's recipe card between us, and I said, "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." Something changed in Kelsey the moment I said that, visibly, the way relief changes a person's whole face when it finally arrives. She nodded once, quickly, in the way people do when they don't trust themselves to say more without crying. Brian reached over and squeezed my hand across the table. And I sat there in the dining room of the house I'd owned for 35 years, with the people who belonged in it, and felt something I can only describe as Gerald being present in the room with us, without being there at all. Those are the moments that make everything else worth navigating. Not the grand resolutions, or the formal conversations, or the agreements written out clearly across a kitchen table. The ordinary Tuesday night dinners where everyone finally feels like they belong exactly where they are. If you've ever found your way back to something ordinary that felt impossible, you know this feeling precisely. I've thought a lot since then about what I would tell someone in my position at month 1, before the hallway got repainted, before the dishes moved, before the remote ever left my hand. I would tell them this. The discomfort you feel when someone treats your home like it's theirs is not rudeness on your part. It's information. And the longer you ignore that information to keep the peace, the more expensive the peace becomes. What I paid for 14 months of silence was my recliner, my mother's lamp, my cream-colored hallway, my kitchen mornings, and more than a few nights of sleep I'll never get back. What I got back when I finally spoke clearly was all of those things, plus a relationship with my son and daughter-in-law that is more honest and more durable than anything we had before the night she grabbed that remote. The silence cost more than the confrontation ever did. I also want to say something about the things I did wrong, because fairness requires it. I stayed quiet for 14 months, when I should have spoken up at month 2. I absorbed small indignities because I was afraid of fracturing my relationship with Brian, not understanding that the silence was already fracturing it from the other direction. I made every accommodation without once checking whether those accommodations were actually helping anyone or simply allowing a dynamic to calcify that would eventually require a truck and a 4-page list to address. I was not a victim of a cruel person. I was a woman who needed to practice saying what she needed out loud instead of hoping the people around her would eventually notice and correct themselves without being asked. If that sounds familiar to you, if you are currently absorbing things quietly for the sake of someone else's comfort, I hope this story gives you permission to stop doing that sooner than I did. The hallway is cream again, by the way. Kelsey repainted it herself, without being asked, about 6 weeks after I moved back in. She bought the exact color. I still had the paint code written on a piece of masking tape stuck to the inside of the garage cabinet, the way Gerald always labeled things, and she did it on a Saturday while I was at Carol's for lunch. When I came home and walked in the front door and saw it, I stood in that hallway for a long moment just breathing. It looked like my house again. It felt like my house again. It smelled like paint and something older underneath, something that had been there since 1988 and had never really left despite everything that had been layered over it in 14 months. I didn't say anything grand about it. I just found Kelsey in the kitchen and told her it looked exactly right. She said, "I know." And somehow that was enough. Brian pulled me aside one evening not long after and said something I want to share with you, because I think it matters. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything that night," he told me. "Not about the house, not about the furniture, but about the specific moment at the television that started all of it. You were standing right there," he said, "and I looked away. I don't know why I did that. I've been thinking about it ever since." I told him honestly that his silence that night had hurt me more than anything Kelsey said, because I expected better from him than from her. He nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I'm going to do better." If you're a son or daughter watching this, please hear what I'm saying carefully. When someone disrespects your parent, your silence is not neutrality. Your silence is a choice. And the people who love you are watching which one you make. The baby is due in April. Kelsey and I have been going to prenatal appointments together on the days Brian can't get away from work, sitting in waiting rooms with magazines between us, talking about names and nursery colors and the specific terror and wonder of becoming a mother for the first time. She asks me questions about Brian's childhood that are so specific and detailed that they make me laugh. What he was afraid of, what he was like when he was sick, whether he cried easily as a baby. I tell her everything, holding nothing back, because I understand now that she's not competing with his past. She's trying to understand the person she's building a future with. That's not a threat. That's exactly what I would want from the woman my son chose to love. It only took 14 months and one very eventful Saturday morning for both of us to figure that out together. I've been asked by a few people since this all unfolded whether I regret letting them move in the first place. The honest answer is no. Not because everything went smoothly, it clearly didn't, but because I believe that the difficult year we lived through produced something that couldn't have been built any easier way. The relationship I have with Brian now is more honest than it's been since he was a teenager. The relationship I'm building with Kelsey is more real than anything we had when she was simply being politely agreeable at family dinners. And the house, my house, Gerald's house, the house where Brian grew up and where a new baby will arrive in April, feels more fully itself than it has in a long time. Sometimes the most important things are built precisely through the difficulty, not despite it. Vanessa and I still have lunch regularly, separate from Marcus, a tradition that started out of an awkward apology and grew into something I genuinely treasure now. She told me recently that she's grateful for how everything unfolded, painful as it was, because it forced both her and Marcus to build their marriage on something real instead of the carefully managed image he'd been hiding behind for years before they ever met. I think about that often. How sometimes the most painful moments in our lives end up clearing space for something far more honest and lasting than what came before them. If this story resonated with you, even a little, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below, because stories like this only matter if they actually help someone else recognize patterns in their own life before it's too late to address them honestly. I still drive to Dallas regularly now, sometimes for visits, sometimes just because I want to. The drive doesn't feel heavy anymore the way it used to in those years when I'd arrive only to be quietly tolerated rather than genuinely welcomed. Last month, Marcus and Vanessa announced they're expecting their first child, and Marcus asked me, without hesitation, if I'd be willing to help out the way I once helped raise him, not as hired help, but as a grandmother, fully present in every sense of the word. I cried for an hour after that phone call, not from sadness this time, but from a kind of relief that's hard to put into words unless you've lived through something similar yourself. If you've made it this far in the story, thank you for staying with me through all of it, because what I want to leave you with in this final part might be the most important thing I've said yet. If there's one thing I hope you carry away from everything I've shared, it's this. The people who truly love you will eventually choose honesty over comfort, even when it's hard, even when it costs them something in the moment. It might not happen immediately. It might take a painful, public moment like the one I lived through to finally force that choice into the open. But real change is possible, even after deep betrayal, if both people are willing to do the harder work that honesty actually requires instead of simply hoping time will quietly fix what words once broke. To everyone watching who has ever felt hidden, diminished, or unseen by someone you sacrificed everything for, your story isn't over, and neither was mine. If this video meant something to you, please subscribe, leave a comment telling me your own story, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for staying until the very end.